Well, you're sitting in a board meeting and someone asks that question. What happens if our pastor gets hit by a bus tomorrow? And instantly you feel it. Everybody just feels uncomfortable. I mean, you're right there, right? Somebody says, oh, he's not going anywhere for years. And then the conversation just dies. This conversation comes up a few times, maybe a couple times a year. And that's about as far as it goes. Does that sound familiar? That's what we're talking about, this whole conversation about succession this week here on the Healthy Church Staff podcast. I like to call it the bus test reality check, okay? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Every church is one phone call away from needing a succession plan. Okay, now if you're the senior pastor, and succession plans can be for every church position, but when we talk about succession for our series this week, we're going to talk mostly about senior pastor. When I say every church is a phone call away from needing a succession plan, that probably makes you really nervous. But I mean, you never know. And this can be an uncomfortable conversation. But yep, we're going to go there. We're going to go there. One phone call away from needing a succession. Maybe there's a heart attack or a family crisis or a moral failure or a burnout. I know it sounds morbid. It feels just kind of cringy even to think about things like that or to even start planning that for things like that. But in reality, it's really responsible leadership. And, you need to start thinking if you're a senior leader, and if you're a board member, you need to think of it with a different hat on, obviously. But if you're a senior leader, you need to start thinking about what's going to happen. What's going to happen to this church, to God's church, but this church after I leave, the day after I leave, what's going to happen? And that can be planned. It can be 20 years from now, if you retire, but it could also be, this bus reality story that plays out. Maybe you literally get hit by a bus. I hope not. But what happens long-term after you leave, but also what would happen in the short term if you were to need to step out of your role? That's the type of transition that nobody talks about and nobody wants to talk about. Most churches, if we're just kind of thinking about reality here, most churches think succession planning is about retirement, and many times it is. So they wait until the pastor hits 60 and they start talking about, slowing down a little bit. And by then it's not planning. It's starting to be a scramble. Your best internal candidates may have already left. Your systems are built around one person if you've been there forever. And that transition discussion becomes kind of trauma instead of triumph. Now listen, nobody wants to think about leaving when they just got there. But smart leaders start succession conversations really early because they love their church, not because they're checking out. Okay? So let's talk about this earlier timeline. Start succession conversations if you're new in your role. I think a good rule of thumb would be to start your succession conversation by about year 3. Again, not because you're leaving, but because you're leading. You're like, Todd, I'm only 35. I don't want to start my succession conversation when I'm 38. But no, seriously, that's part of leading is what's going to happen at this church, at God's church, when I am no longer here. You just need to tackle that conversation very carefully so that they don't feel like you're leaving. Okay, so here's some of the questions you can ask. And you can start with asking yourself these types of questions, right? Who else can preach when I'm gone? What are some things that are in my head that nobody else knows about? Maybe it's, donor relationships. Maybe it's probably practical things. I remember one time, probably 25 years ago, the fire alarm went off and in the church and the fire department was on its way because no one knew the code to shut off the fire alarm. That was in the senior pastor's head. And the fire department would not stop if they didn't have the code. It was just an embarrassing set, and the pastor wasn't available. So what are those kind of things that are in your head that just need to have some place to go so that if you got hit by a bus, for crying out loud, that things would go on as smoothly as possible? I mean, what happens to staff morale if you have a medical emergency, or somebody in your family does, and you have to be out of the office for 6 weeks. I mean, this kind of thing happens more often than what you'd think. Matter of fact, it happens all the time, and most churches and most leaders aren't prepared for it. So the ideal here, the idea I want to put in your head today is that you create leadership depth before you need it. Okay, let me repeat that. As a leader, your goal should be to create some leadership depth before you need it. Create the leadership depth so that everything doesn't depend on you. Cross-train everything. Document all of your processes and build a team that can function without you for a month, at least a month, right? This is what I call a development mindset. Stop thinking, when you think about succession type conversations, you immediately go to replacement, okay? I want you to stop that, at least now, because if you're just at the beginning of the succession kind of mindset and this leadership mindset, I want you to stop thinking right now, initially, about your replacement and start thinking about development. Here's how you can do it. Every staff meeting should be a place where you can start to develop future leaders. Every decision should be building that institutional knowledge across your team and across your staff and across your board. Every crisis that you do encounter, and you know it, you're going to have a crisis, maybe even this week, maybe you've already had one already today. I wouldn't be surprised. Every crisis, though, should be teaching others how to lead because they're watching you. Again, you're not planning your own exit, okay? You're planning their growth. So here's what changes when you start early. And at Chemistry Staffing, we do a lot of succession work, to be quite honest. And most of the succession work that we get is more the scramble part, right? It's our pastor wants to retire, in November. So what do we do? Well, that's a staff search more than it is a succession plan, right? A succession plan should have started probably 3 to 5 years earlier. But here's what will change when you start early, okay? Over time, and this is all part of leadership, your staff will stop being totally dependent upon you, and they will start being developed. When it comes to your board, your board stops getting nervous, and they start feeling and being a little bit more confident. And your church overall stops feeling fragile, and it starts being sustainable. So here's the bottom line for today. Succession planning. When you think succession planning, don't just think, I got to find my replacement. Think about how you're going to lead and how you're going to develop others. Succession planning isn't about when you're leaving. It's about how well you're leading right now. That's the basis. That's the starting point for any good succession plan. So here's your challenge. You're like, Todd, I really haven't thought about this much, but I know I need to. Here's the challenge. Here's where I think you could start this week. I want you to pick one thing, just one thing that only you can do right now. If you were to walk out of your office and get hit by a bus in the parking lot, no one would know how to do this. As a matter of fact, no one would have a clue how you do this. That's one thing I would love for you to teach somebody else this week how to do. It's probably not a major thing. It's not something you're going to have to create a training manual for. It's just something you pull somebody aside and say, hey, this happened to me. And I just wanted you to know, this is how I process this. This is how I dealt with it. Just teach somebody else how to do it. Start small, start simple, but start. Okay? Your church deserves to thrive long after you're gone. Matter of fact, it's not your church, it's God's church. And that legacy starts with the decisions that you make today. Even if you're 35 years old, your legacy starts with the decisions that you make today, 35-year-old leader. So share this with a leader who needs to hear it. And if you've got any questions, I would love to hear from you. You can reach out to me. My website is todd.church. I know it's kind of a weird URL, but todd.church. There's a form there where you can fill it out and get a hold of me. And I'd love to be able to connect you with what we do at Chemistry, or just be able to help your church with any coaching or consulting or just any kind of questions you've got. So todd.church. All right, so tomorrow we're going to continue this story on succession right here on the Healthy Church Staff Podcast. And we've got, 3 more episodes this week, all on the topic of succession. So if you or someone you know or love is working or thinking about a succession plan, go ahead and forward this on to them. I think they'll find it helpful. All right, we'll see you again right back here tomorrow. Have a great one.